Over the past 5 years, Portugal has become one of the most popular destinations in Europe for foreign retirees, digital nomads, and migrants. Low prices, a relaxed lifestyle, and most importantly, a 5-year path to an EU passport made it feel like the perfect choice. But if you're thinking of moving to Portugal today for cheap EU living and an easy path to residency or citizenship, you're chasing a version of Portugal that no longer exists. I emigrated from Russia to Portugal in 2020, lived there for 5 years, and applied for Portuguese citizenship just last month. And after seeing how much the country has changed economically, socially, and politically, I genuinely believe that for most people, it's now too late to move to Portugal. Hi, welcome back to Sense and Sensitivity. If you're new here, this channel follows how my partner Christine and I design a life beyond the 9 to 5, after leaving our careers in law and architectural visualization. The propaganda problem. Google pros and cons of living in Portugal and you'll be flooded with glowing reviews, mainly from immigration law firms and relocation services who stand to profit from people moving there. I like to call this Portuguese propaganda. Best food, best drink, best cultural experience, best city for expats, best beach. Articles like 30 pros and cons of living in Portugal, the real pros and cons of living in Portugal as an expat. These articles are outdated, exaggerate advantages whilst downplaying disadvantages, and often cite conditions that no longer exist, like cheap rent and tax incentives. They list subjective opinion, like amazing food and wine, alongside actual fact, like healthcare systems, mixing opinion with fact. Sure, pastel de nata is good, but I wouldn't move to Portugal because of this. Tax and immigration, broken promises. When I moved 5 years ago, the deal was simple. Live here, integrate, contribute, and apply for citizenship after 5 years. 4.5 years into that process, the Portuguese Parliament passed legislation to extend the residency requirement, proposing 10 years in general or 7 years for EU and CPLP citizens. While parts of the law are being challenged in court, the extended timeline itself has not been overturned, and it remains very likely that longer residency requirement will ultimately apply. If the rules can shift this late in the process, the promise can be reneged on at any moment. If you want a safe, predictable place to build a future, I would definitely reconsider Portugal. At the same time, Portugal created very different rules for very different people. The golden visa, used by high-profile figures like Madonna, Nicole Kidman, John Malkovich, Wayne Rooney, and Scarlett Johansson, required minimal physical presence and no tax residency at all. Spend roughly a week in year 1, 2 weeks every 2 years after that, and you could apply for citizenship in 5 years. This effectively created a 2-tier immigration system, stricter shifting rules for ordinary residents who actually live and work in the country, and more favorable, stable terms for wealthy investors who barely set foot there. That imbalance has fed public frustration and political backlash.
Party workers and supporters are demonstrating against an immigration wave that has gripped the nation. Led by party leader André Ventura, thousands of activists and supporters of Portugal's extreme right-wing Chega party took to the streets of Lisbon on Sunday.
Support for far-right parties like Chega has grown, with increasingly hostile rhetoric towards immigrants in general. The golden visa itself has been tightened repeatedly and may close entirely as the EU has grown openly unfavourable with these types of schemes. Portugal also used to stand out for its non-habitual resident tax regime, which offered extremely favourable treatment to newcomers. Under NHR, many foreign residents paid no Portuguese tax on most foreign-sourced income, including pensions, dividends, and investment income, for up to 10 years. For a long time, this made Portugal a kind of low-tax gateway into the EU, especially attractive to retirees, remote workers, and people earning income abroad. That window has now closed. NHR is no longer available to new arrivals, and it's been replaced by the much narrower IFI-CI regime, which applies only to specific high-skilled roles under tight conditions. If you're considering Portugal today, the safe assumption is you'll be taxed under normal Portuguese rules, unless you very clearly qualify otherwise. Cost of living and housing crisis. For years, Portugal was considered cheap, especially compared to wealthier EU countries. Housing and daily costs were low enough that locals could get by, and immigrants with foreign income felt like they had found a sweet spot. That gap has now closed. Portugal is no longer affordable, not for many locals, and increasingly not for new immigrants either. Housing costs have surged far faster than wages, and purchasing power has deteriorated sharply. According to the European Commission, Portuguese housing prices are now estimated to be overvalued by around 25%, the highest in the EU, while Portugal also ranks among the worst countries in terms of changes in purchasing power. Since 2020, rentals have risen 42% and purchase prices 77%. My first flat in the Algarve in 2020 costed €550 a month. 2 bathrooms, 3 bedrooms, 2 balconies with sea views to Spain. That same apartment now costs over double. And 2 people on minimum wage now couldn't afford it when you take into account electricity and food costs. The CPI has risen 22% since 2020, and that excludes housing. It's a double whammy. A major contributor to the housing crisis has been the golden visa route, through which the Portuguese government attracted too much foreign investment, allowing many wealthy buyers to purchase properties and convert them into Airbnbs. This drove locals to do the same, creating a sort of catch-22 of rising prices and rents. And this had an impact of gentrification, where many local Portuguese now can't afford to live in their own country or area anymore, and they need to move back with family or elsewhere. And legally, landlords can only raise rent 2% annually, but enforcement is inconsistent. Mine raised it 6% on average and kept my deposit without reason at the end of my contract. And this is common practice, since legal fees make fighting back impractical. Bureaucracy and overloaded systems. Portugal has always been a bureaucracy-heavy country. What's changed is that the systems most critical to immigrants have become significantly more strained. AIMA is the National Immigration Agency, and for most immigrants, it becomes the single most important and most frustrating bureaucratic bottleneck. For many, like me, it is the bane of their existence. In practice, it's almost impossible to get an appointment. People queue as early as 3 a.m. for the slim chance of speaking to someone at 8 a.m. when the office opens. The phone line doesn't work at all. It either says no agents are available or disconnects after hours of waiting. Oftentimes, the processes don't even move unless you spend thousands of euros hiring a lawyer to push it forward. I arrived in Portugal before Brexit, so I initially applied through the EU citizen route. Even so, I still spent over 4,000 euros in legal fees through the entire immigration process. I now expect to wait around 24 months just to receive a decision on my citizenship application, with over 500,000 applications ahead of mine and only 674 AIMA employees nationwide. For residency, currently it takes 6 to 18 months for people to get their first residency permit approved, and 2.5 years for the golden visa approval. This matters even more under Portugal's new nationality law. The law now changes when your residency time starts counting towards citizenship. Instead of counting from the date you apply for residency, the clock starts only when your first residency card is actually issued. Taken together, this puts a realistic timeline at a minimum of 13 years from first applying for residency to actually becoming a citizen under the new law. Even the residency card renewals take more than a year. During this time, you can't travel. Leaving the country can breach your residency conditions and can force you to restart the process from outside the country. Healthcare, SNS. It used to be normal to have a family doctor, your essential GP who would be the go-to doctor that could write any statements you may need or even give references. Now it's nearly impossible if you're a new arrival. Around 15% of the Portuguese population doesn't have one, with years-long wait lists. As a Portuguese resident, you need a family doctor because they're your SNS gateway, coordinating referrals, often lowering costs, managing chronic meds and e-prescriptions, keeping vaccinations and records updated, issuing sick notes and medical certificates, enabling SNS 24 bookings and teleconsults, and ensuring faster, continuous primary care, even when you may be traveling. Without a family doctor, regular appointments can take months. I was told in November that the soonest appointment that I could get would be in January, and to see a specialist, the wait times range from 6 to 18 months. In the first half of 2025, over 50% of surgeries in designated hospitals breached the legal maximum wait times. Doctors are overworked. They can be an hour late and often will only address one issue per appointment. I've personally many times needed to book a second appointment just after seeing the doctor, as they only took into account one of my problems. If you can afford private care, it's honestly fine, but if you need to rely on the SNS, I would strongly recommend your other options. To put all of this into perspective, this isn't a temporary backlog, it's systemic. Even my driver's license conversion took 5 years. Corruption and crime. Portugal has long been seen as safe and with a strong rule of law. That's changed. Last year, a week of riots erupted in Lisbon after the PSP, the Portuguese police, shot and killed Odeida Moniz, who lived in Lisbon for 2 decades. Many claimed it was racism. A prominent politician likely to win the next election called the dead man a scumbag. In Portugal's eyes, the police are almost never guilty, nor convicted. Corruption. Portuguese people now see corruption as the third most pressing issue after the cost of living crisis and weak economic development. In 2023, the Eurobarometer found 93% of Portuguese consider corruption common practice, 23% higher than the EU average. In 2024, Portugal scored 57 out of 100 on the corruption perception, below countries like Botswana, Chile, and Saudi Arabia. Former Prime Minister Antonio Costa resigned in 2023 after corruption probes raided his official residence and detained staff. They found €75,000 in cash envelopes, and the following year he became president of the European Council, a role that he still holds until this day. Daily life impact. Many places only take cash to avoid tax. You'll get ripped off frequently. I learned to fix shutters, electronics, and more myself. Even a phone repair shop stole my fingerprint sensor and charged me for the repair. I have other experiences with crime and corruption in Portugal, but I think this one that I'm about to say is pretty telling. My then partner and I were in a restaurant. We were discriminated against and we called the police. The police came and left without even speaking to us. And after they left, we were then robbed and assaulted, inside and outside the premises, all on CCTV. We were told to go back to our own countries, as well as racist slurs. Portuguese men and women battered her and stamped on my head simultaneously. Over €2,000 in damages, and I needed hospital care. We reported it immediately. The police didn't question the attackers, even though we pointed them out while they were still there. At the station, the translator refused to translate properly, and I was yelled at by the police despite my head injury, which really hurt. We provided names, photos, dates of birth later after doing digging online. Months passed, nothing happened, and nothing ever will. I waited 9 hours in A&E and was shouted at by a doctor, and I've needed to take daily medication ever since. That experience permanently changed my trust in the Portuguese police and healthcare system. And this isn't just personal. Multiple reports show a sharp rise in hate speech targeting migrants and complaints linked to discrimination and incitement to violence. Even the old immigration agency, which preceded AIMA, called CEF, was reformed as official inspectors at Lisbon airport beat a Ukrainian man to death in 2020. The director also covered up the incident, but luckily and unusually, it was brought to light. I also personally know many Eastern Europeans with stories of discrimination in Portugal, and it's really saddening. Brain drain, education and healthcare. There is also a deeper problem that's harder to reverse. Portugal trains people, but struggles to keep them. And when skilled workers leave, the systems that depend on them, like schools, hospitals, public services, start to hollow out. On paper, education actually hasn't changed that much in the past few years. It still ranks slightly below EU standards. Tertiary attainment sits at around 44%, and adult skills in literacy and numeracy remain below the OECD average. But what's changed is the pressure on the workforce. More education professionals are leaving for other EU countries, and with an aging workforce, shortages and strikes have become a recurring feature. At the same time, the average cost of public university can actually be pretty reasonable, around €600 a year. But this is where the lived reality matters. In Portugal, consistent application of the law isn't guaranteed. In my case, despite retaining my rights under the UK and EU withdrawal agreement and following all legal procedures, I was still asked to pay international student fees simply because I'm not a Portuguese national, even though that classification conflicted with Portuguese and EU law. It happened after I had already spent over €1,000 on preparation, interviews, and entrance exams, and it effectively blocked me from attending university that year. It's also worth understanding the generational context. It's not uncommon to meet older people who can't read or write, a legacy of the dictatorship years when many left school early to work. Luckily though, adult literacy today is at around 97%. The brain drain is even more visible in healthcare. In 2023, around 60% of newly qualified nurses requested documentation to work abroad. Because Portugal is in the EU, nurses and doctors can move easily, and many do, for higher pay and better working conditions. The result is predictable: longer waiting times, worsening access, and strained quality. If you're a professional moving to Portugal and setting up shop, be prepared that the talent you expect to hire may have already left. strikes and public service disruption. Zooming out, brain drain, cost of living crisis, and weak state capacity is showing up more visible way too: strikes. In 2023, Portugal saw 238 strikes, involving 61,254 workers and 77,753 workdays lost. This wasn't just a statistic, it disrupted daily life across the country. To put that into perspective with the other places I've lived, the same year, New Zealand recorded 22 official work stoppages and Mexico reported 4 strikes. And here's the deeper point. If workers have to organize mass strikes just to be treated fairly rather than having disputes resolved through functioning labor systems, then the problem isn't just wages, it's institutional maltreatment. So you may be left wondering, how does this affect normal life? Teacher and school staff strikes mean intermittent school closures and many short notice cancellations. Parents are forced into last-minute childcare scrambles or taking time off work. Reuters covers major teacher mobilizations, but families feel the disruption first. Strikes compound the SNS issues already mentioned: postpone consultations and procedures, grow backlogs, and routine care gets bumped though emergency coverage is still maintained. Rail strikes cause recurring cancellations and service disruptions, brutal for commuters and day trippers. CP issued repeated strike impact warnings throughout 2023, and in the same year, air travel was hit hard too. 1,316 flights cancelled, affecting around 160,000 passengers, as well as delays at airports due to border inspector strikes. Even when you can travel, strikes create uncertainty, missed connections, longer queues, itinerary changes. That hurts visitor experience and raises operator costs. When rail and air are disrupted, tourists pile into buses, taxis, and rentals, and last-minute accommodation changes push prices up and create friction. These knock-on effects are real. Lost production, parents missing out on work, delayed commerce. The disruption was broad enough that in 2023, it increased political pressure for wage and condition reforms across public services. Personally, I've made plans countless times, only to wait hours for trains due to delays and the chronic unreliability of the public transport. Relying on Portuguese infrastructure and travelling is honestly exhausting. If you're planning to move to Portugal, factor these in, as strikes are a regular part of life, and they can and will disrupt your work, your children's education, your healthcare, and your ability to travel. In conclusion, Portugal can be a great move if you're passionate about the culture, slower pace, family ties, the language, if you like the food, and can afford private healthcare. There are genuine positives that you'll find everywhere online, but make sure that you weigh these factors in too, and don't forget to be critical. As always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit that like, notification button, and subscribe. Bye!